New York has always been described as the city that never sleeps, a place where fortunes are made and destroyed overnight, where skyscrapers rise like monuments to ambition and greed. In this restless city stood the glass tower of Hayes Global, a company known for its enormous real estate holdings across Manhattan. Its logo shone like a promise on the skyline, modern, bold, unshakable. Yet, inside that tower, the foundations of trust were already beginning to crack. The story begins not with a sudden act of violence or a sensational scandal splashed across headlines, but with a slow erosion of silence, suspicion, and arrogance. Eleanor Hayes, widow of the company's co-founder, had inherited both the fortune and the burden of Hayes Global. Her husband, Michael Hayes, had been the driving force for decades. He was admired, feared, and celebrated as one of the most visionary developers of his time. When he passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack 2 years earlier, Eleanor stepped into his role with hesitation but with a cold determination not to let the empire collapse. To the press, she became known as the Iron Lady of Wall Street real estate. Photographed at charity galas in sleek gowns, quoted in financial magazines with words sharp and concise, she embodied control. But inside, Eleanor was worn down by a relentless fight to maintain her husband's legacy while fending off sharks circling the company, waiting for any weakness. Her circle of trust was shrinking every month. Among those sharks was Richard Blackwell, a name familiar in every investment circle in the city. Blackwell was charming, silver-haired, and meticulous. He had an uncanny ability to make people believe that aligning with him meant security. He ran a private equity firm that had financed dozens of real estate ventures across the East Coast. Yet, his reputation was double-edged. Some called him brilliant. Others, quietly, called him ruthless. His philosophy was simple: take control before anyone realizes what's happening. And then, there was Samuel Turner, Sam to the few who remembered his name. He was invisible in the tower, a janitor hired by a contracting company, tasked with cleaning offices long after executives left. He wore plain uniforms that always smelled faintly of bleach, kept his head down, and pushed his cart with silent efficiency. In the hierarchy of the building, he existed outside of recognition. People passed by him in elevators without a glance. Yet Sam had a habit that no one noticed: he listened. Every night, as he emptied trash bins and wiped conference tables, he absorbed fragments of conversations left behind. Scraps of paper tossed into bins, printouts with highlighted lines, whispers exchanged in hallways when executives assumed no one else was around. Sam pieced these fragments together like clues, not because he sought drama, but because he had lived long enough to know that wealth often hid rot beneath marble floors. Eleanor first noticed Sam one winter evening when she returned late to the office. Most employees had already left, but Sam was polishing the brass fixtures in the lobby. He greeted her with a polite nod, nothing more. Yet, when she stepped into the elevator, she caught his eyes briefly. They weren't the glazed, indifferent eyes of a tired worker. They were alert, observant, as if they measured every detail of her presence. For reasons she could not explain, that gaze unsettled her. The backdrop of the opening event was the annual Heart of the Metropolis Gala, one of New York's most extravagant charity evenings, hosted by Hayes Global in partnership with several banks. It was Eleanor's attempt to reaffirm her company's influence. The guest list included mayors, hedge fund titans, fashion icons, and journalists hungry for soundbites. The ballroom was adorned with chandeliers, velvet curtains, and champagne towers stacked like pyramids of gold. Eleanor arrived dressed in navy silk, understated compared to the glittering sequins of other attendees, but deliberate in its elegance. Richard Blackwell arrived late, making an entrance with the confidence of a man who owned the room. He shook hands, laughed in rehearsed bursts, and whispered promises of lucrative ventures to anyone within earshot. For weeks, he had been pressing Eleanor to sign what he described as a strategic partnership agreement, one that would supposedly secure Hayes Global's liquidity and expand its reach internationally. Eleanor, skeptical but pressured by declining profits, had agreed to review the contract. What no one at that gala suspected was that Blackwell's proposal was not a lifeline but a trap. Hidden in the fine print was a clause that would give him majority control over the company's assets within months. It was not the kind of fraud that unfolded in one violent strike. It was the kind that spread like poison through paper, signatures, and legal jargon. Eleanor was too seasoned to sign blindly, but fatigue had begun to dull her instinct. In that same ballroom, unnoticed by most, Sam was at work. His company had been contracted to handle cleanup after the event, so he lingered at the periphery, gathering empty glasses and discreetly straightening linens. Unlike the guests, he saw the gala from ground level, the anxious glances between investors, the forced laughter, the way Eleanor's smile tightened every time Blackwell leaned closer. He also saw something no one else cared about, the leather briefcase Blackwell carried, which he never let out of his sight. When Blackwell rested it against his chair, Sam caught the faint glint of a second folder peeking out beneath the flap. It was a detail so small it meant nothing at the time. But in stories of crime and betrayal, it is often the smallest details, the kind only someone invisible notices, that shift the course of everything. That night marked the opening act of a story in which an overlooked janitor would become the unexpected fulcrum between fraud and justice. For Eleanor, it was the beginning of her gravest test as custodian of her husband's empire. For Blackwell, it was the first step toward what he believed would be his greatest triumph. For Sam, though, it was a moment of recognition, a whisper from instinct that told him something was wrong in this glittering tower. What no one realized yet was that the battle for Hayes Global had already begun, not in boardrooms or stock markets, but in the quiet awareness of a man everyone assumed was invisible. Sam Turner had never considered himself an important man. He was the janitor, the one who swept the floors when the crowds were gone, the one who fixed broken light bulbs and unclogged drains while the company's executives slept comfortably in their suburban homes. For years he had moved through the corridors of Hayes Global almost invisible, blending into the walls like the faint hum of the air conditioning. But on that particular week, something began to shift. He first noticed it during the late-night hours, when he was emptying the trash bins on the executive floor. Most nights were quiet, but on Tuesday he caught a flicker of movement inside the boardroom. Through the glass wall he saw Richard Blackwell, the celebrated consultant, sitting alone with his briefcase open. Papers were spread across the long mahogany table. Sam paused, mop in hand, as Blackwell carefully removed a folder from the inside lining of the briefcase. The man's posture was rigid, and though Sam couldn't hear the words, he watched Blackwell mutter to himself as he reviewed the papers. It wasn't unusual for executives to work late. But what unsettled Sam was the way Blackwell froze every few seconds, glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to catch him. The janitor knew the behavior of people who were simply working overtime. This was not that. This was a man hiding in plain sight. Sam kept walking, resisting the urge to linger. Still, he filed the moment away. He had a memory like a trap when it came to small details, something that had always set him apart though no one cared enough to notice. The next day, Eleanor Hayes did something that startled him even more. She approached him directly, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her presence commanding yet strangely softened. She asked him to attend a business meeting. He had laughed nervously, convinced she must have mistaken him for someone else. But she had looked him straight in the eyes and told him she trusted him. That word trust lodged itself in Sam's chest. Nobody had ever used it in relation to him before. On the morning of the meeting, Sam dressed in the only clean button-down shirt he owned. It was faded at the collar, but he ironed it as best he could. His cap, old and worn, sat firmly on his head as if it could shield him from the strangeness of what he was about to face. Walking into the conference hall, Sam immediately felt out of place. The carpet beneath his boots was thick, the kind that muffled footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and polished wood. Suited men and women filled the room, their voices low and controlled, their gazes sharp. Sam could feel them studying him with thinly veiled disdain. He kept his head down, following Eleanor's lead as she ushered him toward the long table. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, and for a brief second he believed he might survive this humiliation. Richard Blackwell sat across from them, every inch of him exuding confidence. He greeted Eleanor with a courteous nod, ignoring Sam altogether, as though the janitor were nothing more than furniture. His briefcase rested by his chair, just within reach. The meeting began. Blackwell spoke with precision, his voice smooth, each phrase carefully calculated. He proposed a partnership deal that promised exponential growth, using words that sounded impressive but, to Sam's ears, felt hollow. He spoke of synergy and mutual advantage, yet his eyes darted to Eleanor with the hunger of a predator who thought he'd already secured his prey. Sam's palms were sweaty. He understood little of the jargon, but he understood people. He understood the weight of silence, the dart of suspicious eyes, the tightening of a jaw. And then he saw it. Peeking out from beneath the flap of Blackwell's briefcase was a sheet of paper. At first, he thought it was nothing, just another contract in a sea of documents. But as Blackwell shifted, Sam caught a better glimpse of the heading. It wasn't Hayes Global's logo, it belonged to one of their fiercest competitors. The text, though upside down and partially obscured, mentioned terms that directly contradicted the promises Blackwell was making aloud. Sam froze. His heart pounded in his ears. He thought of staying quiet. He thought of the humiliation that would come if he was wrong, if he misread the situation, if he embarrassed Eleanor in front of her board. Who was he, after all? Just a janitor. But then he remembered the late-night sight of Blackwell whispering to himself over those papers, the way he guarded his briefcase like it contained something forbidden. And he remembered Eleanor's words, "I trust you." So, with a shaky breath, Sam spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice breaking the rhythm of the meeting like a crack of thunder. Heads turned. A few executives frowned at him, incredulous. Blackwell's eyes narrowed, flashing irritation. Eleanor's face remained calm, curious. "There's something under your briefcase," Sam continued, pointing nervously. "I think it's important." The room went silent. For a long moment, Blackwell didn't move. His jaw tightened, and the confident gleam in his eyes dimmed just slightly. Reluctantly, he slid the briefcase aside, revealing the document. Eleanor reached forward and picked it up. She read quickly, her eyes sharp. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. When she finally looked up, her gaze locked on Blackwell. "This," she said evenly, "is not what you've been telling us." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Blackwell shifted in his seat, his smooth facade crumbling at the edges. He stammered, fumbling for explanations, but the room had already shifted. Everyone could see it now, the mask had slipped. Sam sat rigid in his chair, terrified yet strangely calm. He hadn't planned to be a part of this, yet somehow his voice had changed the course of the meeting. He had exposed something hidden. He had mattered. And for the first time in his life, the janitor felt seen. Sam never thought his words could carry that much weight. For years he had been invisible, moving silently through the corridors of the Sterling Corporation, pushing his mop, fixing light bulbs, replacing paper towels. Yet a single shaky sentence, "There's something under the briefcase," had shifted the course of an entire boardroom. When Eleanor Sterling picked up that paper and confronted Victor Blackwell, Sam felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never asked for attention. The sudden focus of so many sharp, suspicious eyes made him sweat through his shirt. And yet, deep down, there was something else stirring, an uneasy awareness that once you reveal something hidden, you can't put it back. That night, back in his small apartment on the edge of the city, Sam lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the hum of the old radiator. The room was modest, almost bare, one wooden chair, a clock that ticked too loudly, and a faded photograph of his parents on the dresser. Sleep refused to come. He kept replaying the meeting in his mind, the way Eleanor's voice shifted from calm to sharp, the way Victor's jaw tightened when the document was revealed, and the quick flicker of panic in the assistant's eyes. Why had Eleanor trusted him? Why him, of all people? He was a janitor, not a lawyer or an executive. He had no degree, no training in corporate battles. And yet she had singled him out, asked him to attend, and when the moment came, his instincts had pointed to that hidden paper. Sam tried to tell himself it was luck, coincidence. But something in his gut whispered otherwise. The following morning, Eleanor called him into her office. For Sam, walking into the CEO's private space felt like stepping into another world. The walls were lined with dark oak shelves filled with books and leather-bound ledgers. Framed photographs of Eleanor with her late husband hung in careful symmetry. On her desk sat a glass sculpture that caught the morning light and scattered it into shards across the room. "Sit down, Sam," she said gently, motioning to the chair opposite her. He obeyed, trying not to look too awkward. "I need to tell you something," she began, her eyes steady. "That document you pointed out, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof of something I had suspected for months. Blackwell has been in contact with our biggest rival, Cambridge Dynamics. He's been trying to push me into a deal that would have drained us and handed them control." Sam swallowed hard. "So, I really did help?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "More than you know." But instead of feeling proud, Sam felt his chest tighten. If what she said was true, then Blackwell wasn't just a pushy consultant, he was a traitor. And men like that didn't take kindly to being exposed. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. On Wednesday, as Sam was leaving work, he noticed a black sedan parked across the street from his apartment building. Its windows were tinted, and though he couldn't see inside, he felt the weight of someone's eyes following him as he climbed the steps to his door. On Thursday, a coworker mentioned seeing Blackwell storm out of the building after a private meeting with Eleanor. "He looked furious," she whispered in the break room. "Like a man who just lost everything." By Friday, Sam's nerves were fraying. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder more often, jumping at small sounds. Once, while mopping the executive floor, he thought he saw Blackwell's assistant lingering in the hallway, pretending to check her phone but watching him closely. When he turned, she quickly walked away. The unease grew heavier. Sam wasn't a paranoid man by nature, but he had lived his life on the edges long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. The air around him felt charged, as though the quiet routines of his life had been replaced by currents he couldn't control. That weekend, he met Eleanor again. She had invited him to a quiet cafe near the Charles River, far from the sterile glass towers of downtown Boston. The choice of location surprised him. It was modest, the kind of place where fishermen stopped in for coffee before dawn. "I chose here," she explained, stirring her tea, "because I don't think we're being watched here. At the office. I can't be sure anymore." Sam frowned. "You think someone's watching you too?" Eleanor leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I know they are. Victor's desperate. When powerful men are cornered, they don't go down quietly." Her words sent a chill through Sam's chest. He had thought his role ended the moment Eleanor confronted Blackwell. But now it seemed that by speaking up, he had been pulled into something far more dangerous. "What do you want me to do?" Sam asked. Eleanor studied him carefully. "I want you to keep doing what you've always done. Observe. People overlook you, Sam. That's your gift. No one suspects the janitor is listening. If you notice anything unusual, anything out of place, you tell me immediately." Sam hesitated, then nodded slowly. He had spent years fading into the background, but maybe that invisibility was exactly why Eleanor trusted him. That night, walking home through the narrow streets, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that his life had taken a turn he hadn't chosen. He thought about his late father, a factory worker who always told him, "Honesty will carry you further than strength ever could." He wondered what his father would say now, knowing his son was caught between the most powerful woman in the city and a consultant with dangerous connections. When he reached his apartment, Sam paused at the door. A thin white envelope was tucked under the frame. His name was written on the front in blocky letters. He picked it up with trembling hands and opened it inside under the dim kitchen light. The message was short. Only 5 words, typed in cold black ink. "Stay quiet. Or else." Sam stared at the note until the words blurred. His throat tightened. For years, silence had been his shield. He had survived by staying in the background, unnoticed. But now, silence was being demanded of him like a threat. And he knew, deep down, that choosing silence this time would come at a far greater cost. Sam Price had never been inside the company's boardroom before that fateful meeting with Mrs. Ellison and Victor Blackwell. The memory stayed with him like a thorn beneath the skin, irritating, persistent, and impossible to forget. The polished oak table, the towering windows that overlooked the Boston skyline, and the predatory way Victor had leaned back in his chair, as if he owned not only the room but everyone in it. Sam replayed that moment in his head too often, his trembling voice breaking the silence, his finger pointing toward the paper wedged beneath the briefcase, and the way Mrs. Ellison's eyes sharpened when she read what was written there. That moment had changed everything. Sam was no longer invisible. He had become the man who spoke when no one else dared. The janitor who disrupted the natural order of things. Some called it bravery, others whispered it was foolishness. But in Sam's heart, he wasn't sure what it had been. Instinct? Desperation? Maybe even something he couldn't name. What he did know was this: from that day forward, his life was no longer his own. The company corridors, once indifferent, now seemed to watch him. People who never noticed him before suddenly whispered his name. He caught glances, some respectful, some suspicious, others filled with something darker. Not everyone was happy that the janitor had stepped out of line. The first sign came 2 weeks later. It was a Thursday night, long after most employees had gone home. Sam had stayed late, wiping down the marble lobby floors. The emptiness of the building comforted him, a return to the quiet life he knew. But as he moved his mop across the smooth stone, he heard something unusual, footsteps echoing in the stairwell, too heavy and too deliberate for someone who had simply forgotten their coat or briefcase. Sam froze, his hand tightening on the mop handle. The sound stopped. Silence hung heavy. He told himself not to be paranoid, that in a building this large someone else was bound to linger behind. Still, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand. He decided to leave. When he reached the parking lot, his old sedan waited beneath the flickering lamp. But what made him pause was the car across from his, a sleek black SUV, engine running, windows tinted. The driver didn't move, didn't get out, just sat there, engine purring softly like a predator crouched in the dark. Sam forced himself not to stare. He climbed into his car, his heart thumping, and pulled away. In the rearview mirror, he saw the SUV's headlights blink on. It followed him for 3 blocks before vanishing at an intersection. That night, Sam didn't sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Ellison called him into her office. He had expected her to speak about the meeting, about Victor Blackwell's sudden silence after the document had been revealed, maybe even about the subtle shift in alliances within the company. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice low. "Sam, I need you to be honest with me. Has anyone approached you since that meeting?" Sam blinked, caught off guard. "No, ma'am. No one. Not even casually? A conversation that felt unusual?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No. Nothing like that." Mrs. Ellison studied him for a long moment. Her sharp gaze softened, but not with comfort, with calculation. "Good. Keep it that way. And if anyone does, you come straight to me." Sam nodded, though unease knotted in his stomach. Later that week, while emptying trash bins in the accounting wing, he found something odd, a folder tossed carelessly into the bin beneath a junior analyst's desk. Papers stuck out, some shredded, some intact. He gathered them out of habit. After all, it was his job to dispose of waste. But when his eyes fell across the top page, he froze. It was a contract draft. Names, numbers, signatures, some belonging to board members he recognized. At the bottom, in faint but deliberate handwriting, was a single phrase: "Remove the obstacle." Sam's breath caught. He stared at the page, unsure if he should leave it or slip it into his pocket. His conscience battled his fear. If this note meant what he thought it meant, he was the obstacle. The janitor who spoke out. The man who had ruined Victor Blackwell's scheme. But if he kept it, he risked being discovered. He folded the page and slid it into his pocket. His hand shook as he carried the rest of the trash to the chute, his mind racing. That night, he sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the paper under the dim glow of the overhead light. The words mocked him. Remove the obstacle. He imagined Victor's cold eyes, the way he had clenched his jaw when Mrs. Ellison confronted him with the hidden document. Victor was not the type to forgive. Sam felt torn between choices. Should he bring this to Mrs. Ellison? Or would involving her only paint a larger target on his back? Should he go to the police? But what would he even say? That he, a janitor, had found a scrap of paper in a trash bin? They'd laugh at him, maybe even suspect he planted it. The clock ticked past midnight, each second loud in the silence. Finally, Sam slid the paper into an old coffee tin beneath his sink. If nothing else, he'd keep it safe. But safety was an illusion. 2 days later, when he returned to his apartment after a late shift, he noticed something strange. The door to his unit, though locked, bore faint scratches near the lock as if someone had tried to pick it. Inside, nothing was stolen, but a single detail unsettled him more than theft ever could. His coffee tin sat on the kitchen counter, its lid slightly ajar. Sam's chest tightened. Someone had been inside. Someone had searched his home. He opened the tin. The paper was gone. Panic surged through him. Whoever had taken it knew he had seen it. They knew he was aware of the threat. And now, they had erased the only piece of evidence he held. That night, Sam sat on his couch, staring into the dark, his pulse racing. His life had shifted again, and this time, it wasn't recognition he received, it was danger. He realized the fracture had begun, the line between janitor and investigator, between ordinary man and marked target. And there was no going back. Tom Matthews never thought a mop and broom could lead him into the center of something far bigger than himself. Yet as the days passed after that first fateful meeting in Mrs. Ellison's boardroom, he realized the threads of the story were tightening around him like ropes, each one pulled by an unseen hand. He had uncovered the hidden document beneath Victor Blackwell's briefcase, and in doing so, had accidentally lifted the veil on a conspiracy that most men in his position would have ignored. On the surface, everything seemed unchanged. He still walked the same polished hallways, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies, nodding to employees who hardly gave him a second glance. But inside, Tom felt different. He was no longer invisible, not to Mrs. Ellison, not to Blackwell, and not to whoever had been bold enough to slip into his apartment. The air around him seemed heavier, as though every shadow hid an eye, every whisper a warning. Mrs. Ellison had asked him to remain calm, to continue as if nothing had changed, but Tom knew better. He had grown up in tough neighborhoods where danger lingered at the edges of street corners. That instinct, the one that told him when to cross the road, when to keep his mouth shut, when to trust no one, was buzzing louder now than it had in decades. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. One evening, after finishing his rounds, Tom stepped out into the crisp Boston night. The city was alive as always, horns blaring in traffic, neon signs flickering, footsteps echoing across sidewalks. But for Tom, every sound felt sharper, every face too focused on him. He walked to his sedan parked at the far end of the lot, only to notice faint tire tracks beside it, fresh despite the lack of rain. A cigarette butt lay nearby, still warm when he touched it. Someone had been waiting. That night he sat in his small kitchen, lights off, listening. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He glanced at the coffee tin on the counter, now empty, its hidden document gone. Whoever broke in hadn't stolen cash or valuables, they had come for proof. Proof that Tom had seen what he wasn't supposed to see. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Blackwell wasn't just a rival businessman hungry for power, he was part of a larger machine. The document hinted at fraud, backdoor deals, and a pattern of manipulation designed to push Mrs. Ellison into a corner until she had no choice but to surrender her company. Tom, by sheer chance and honesty, had stepped directly into the crosshairs of that machine. Mrs. Ellison summoned him again, this time not to a boardroom, but to her private office overlooking the harbor. The room smelled faintly of leather and sea air, her desk stacked with files. She looked tired, her normally sharp posture softened by the weight of secrecy. "Tom," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I need to ask you something, and I'll understand if you refuse." Tom nodded slowly, hands folded in his lap. "I believe Blackwell has people inside this company, people feeding him information, sabotaging me from within. The document you found proved it. But it wasn't enough. We need more evidence that can't be denied in court, something to bring him down. Tom felt his stomach twist. You're saying you want me to investigate? I'm saying you're the only one I can trust, she replied, her gaze steady. They'll never suspect you. To them, you're just the janitor. But you've seen how people overlook you. Use that. Watch. Listen. Record. And bring me what you find. Her words sank into him like stones dropped into water. He wasn't a detective, wasn't trained for espionage. He was a man who spent his life scrubbing floors. But deep down, Tom knew he had already started down this path the moment he spoke up in that boardroom. Backing out now wasn't an option. The following days turned into a blur of cautious steps and sharpened senses. Tom began carrying a small notebook in his pocket, jotting down names, times, odd conversations overheard while dusting shelves or wiping down conference tables. He learned to linger unnoticed, broom in hand, while executives whispered in hallways. He memorized patterns: who met with whom, who left papers carelessly exposed, who avoided eye contact when he passed. One night, long after the offices had emptied, Tom discovered something unusual. In one of the executive lounges, a fax machine was spitting out papers even though no one was there. He approached carefully, hard hammering. The pages contained financial transfers routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, transactions tied directly to Blackwell's firm. He gathered the papers quickly, but before he could slip them into his cart, the door creaked. A man stepped in, a junior manager he had seen before. Their eyes met. For a moment, time froze. Then Tom forced a laugh, holding up the papers. Machines gone crazy again, he muttered, weighting them like scrap. Guess I'll toss these with the rest. The manager smirked faintly, gave a nod, and left without question. Tom's hands shook as he slid the documents deep into his uniform pocket. But the closer he looked, the more dangerous it became. One morning, while mopping the marble lobby, Tom caught sight of a man leaning against the wall, dressed in a suit too sharp for the hour. The man never spoke, never moved, just watched. Later that night, Tom noticed the same face reflected in the glass of a coffee shop window across from his apartment. Whoever they weren't just watching Mrs. Ellison anymore, they were watching him. The tension took its toll. Tom slept less, his dreams filled with shadows and muffled footsteps. He found himself jumping at the sound of a phone ringing, scanning mirrors for cars following too close. The city, once his comfort, now felt like a labyrinth designed to swallow him whole. And yet, in the quiet moments, Tom thought of something deeper: justice. For years, he had believed men like him didn't matter. That janitors, cleaners, and the forgotten workers of the world were invisible, replaceable. But here he was, standing against a man who thought he could crush lives with money and lies. Maybe, Tom thought, his invisibility was his greatest strength. One late evening, as the office building emptied out, Tom slipped into a restricted records room he had been eyeing for days. He had memorized the guard's rotation, timed the cameras, and waited until the perfect moment. Inside, rows of file cabinets stretched endlessly. He pulled open drawers, scanning folders until one label froze him: Blackwell Holdings, Internal Memoranda. He opened it, revealing letters and contracts marked confidential. Among them, one document made his blood run cold. It wasn't about business. It was about him. Matthews, liability. Removed before final negotiation. Tom's hands trembled as he held the page. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was a death sentence, written plainly on paper. He tucked the document inside his shirt, heart racing. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed, followed by footsteps echoing closer. He froze, every muscle tense, clutching the paper to his chest. The hunt had begun. The winter wind rattled against the tall glass panes of the corporate tower as if it, too, had grown restless with the secret swirling inside. Jonathan Hale, still officially just the janitor in public records, sat alone in the employee lounge that evening, his mop leaning against the wall, his coffee cooling in front of him. On the surface, he appeared as he always had, a man invisible to executives and nearly forgotten by coworkers. But beneath that quiet surface, Jonathan carried knowledge that could upend careers, topple reputations, and possibly endanger his own life. The events of the past weeks had left him in constant unease. Ever since Miss Caldwell had pulled him into that boardroom, Jonathan had lived in two worlds, the one everyone saw, where he emptied trash bins and polished brass rails, and the shadowed one, where he sifted through confidential memos and guarded secrets not meant for him. It was in this latter world that his instincts, once dulled by years of routine, had sharpened into something more dangerous, something closer to survival. That evening, Jonathan had just finished replacing the trash bags in the finance department when his eye caught a half-crumpled memo stuffed deep into the bin. Normally, he wouldn't have thought twice, but the embossed seal at the top, Blackwell Holdings LLC, snared his attention. That name had become a specter haunting his thoughts since he had seen it hidden beneath Blackwell's briefcase during the tense board meeting. Carefully, he smoothed the wrinkled page on his cart. The memo was brief, coded in the kind of vague corporate jargon designed to conceal more than it revealed. Yet one line stood out: projected consolidation of minority assets contingent upon non-disclosure agreement. Immediate execution advised. He didn't know the full meaning, but Jonathan knew one thing: this wasn't ordinary paperwork. Someone was consolidating something quickly, quietly, and without the transparency Miss Caldwell insisted upon. His stomach tightened. He slid the paper into the side pocket of his cleaning cart, hiding it between rags and polished cans. By the time he returned to the lounge, the office floors had emptied. Outside, Boston's skyline glowed in the winter haze. He unfolded the memo again, tracing the words with his callous fingers. A cold realization washed over him: these deals weren't just numbers. They affected real people, livelihoods, and maybe even the future of the company itself. And if Blackwell or whoever was behind this found out he had intercepted the document, Jonathan knew he'd be cast as the scapegoat or worse. As if conjured by his fears, the door to the lounge creaked open. Marcus Dean, one of Blackwell's junior analysts, stepped inside. His sharp suit contrasted starkly with Jonathan's worn uniform. Dean froze for a moment upon seeing him, his gaze darting toward the edge of the table where Jonathan quickly folded the memo. The analyst smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Burning the midnight oil, Hale?" he asked casually, though his voice carried an edge of suspicion. "Just finishing up," Jonathan replied, keeping his tone flat, nonchalant. Dean lingered, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes scanning the table. After a few tense seconds, he gave a tight nod and left. The moment the door clicked shut, Jonathan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The next morning, Miss Caldwell summoned him to her office. She looked composed as ever, but Jonathan could sense the tension in her posture. On her desk lay a different folder, its papers neatly arranged, yet her hand rested protectively over them. "Jonathan," she began, her voice steady, "you may not realize it, but what you uncovered the other day may have saved this company from signing away its integrity. But we're not done. Blackwell is still maneuvering. And I fear he has allies inside our own house." Her words confirmed Jonathan's unease. He hesitated before sliding the crumpled memo across her desk. "Found this last night. Thought you should see it." Miss Caldwell's eyes narrowed as she read. A flicker of anger crossed her otherwise calm face. "They're accelerating," she muttered. "Consolidating minority assets. That means silencing smaller stakeholders, possibly even forcing people out without compensation. It's ruthless. And it explains why Blackwell has been pushing for confidentiality." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ma'am, I'm just a janitor. I don't belong in this." But Miss Caldwell looked directly into his eyes, her expression firm yet almost maternal. "Don't underestimate yourself, Jonathan. You see things others overlook. That's why they fear you. And that's why I trust you." The weight of her trust both reassured and unsettled him. He nodded reluctantly. "So, what now?" "Now," she said quietly, "we find proof strong enough to bring this into the light. Without it, they'll bury us both." The investigation began in whispers and shadows. Jonathan, now acting as Caldwell's eyes in the unseen corners of the company, carried out his nightly cleaning duties while discreetly scanning discarded documents, unattended laptops, and office mail trays. He wasn't trained for this, but his years of invisibility had made him a natural observer. People spoke freely around him, dismissing him as part of the background. And in those careless conversations, fragments of the truth began to emerge. One evening, he overheard two executives whispering in the break room. "The Cayman accounts are ready," one said. "As long as the board signs off, the transfers will be untraceable." The other chuckled nervously. "Let's just hope no one looks too closely." Blackwell promised this would be smooth. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Cayman accounts. Offshore transfers. These weren't just shady practices, they were the kinds of schemes that had destroyed companies before. He jotted down what he heard on a scrap of paper and tucked it into his pocket. Yet the deeper he went, the more he realized the danger. Twice, he noticed unfamiliar security guards patrolling floors they had never covered before. Once, he caught Marcus Dean following him through the parking garage, pretending to check his phone but keeping just a little too close. The paranoia gnawed at him. At home, he began locking his doors twice, triple-checking the windows. He slept lightly, every creak of the old floorboards jolting him awake. And yet, despite his fear, he couldn't walk away. Not now. The breaking point came one night when Jonathan discovered a shredded envelope in Blackwell's secretary's bin. Patiently, he reassembled the fragments on his cart. The pieces formed a single, chilling line: "Hale must be discredited before Q1 review." His throat went dry. They knew his name. They were planning to ruin him, perhaps frame him, erase his credibility before he could say another word. The next morning, Jonathan handed the reconstructed note to Ms. Caldwell. For the first time since he had met her, he saw fear flicker in her eyes. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Jonathan, listen carefully. They've crossed a line. You are no longer safe in the shadows. From now on, you're a target." Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. He had always been invisible. Now, for the first time in his life, his invisibility was gone, and that made him vulnerable. But in that moment, he also understood something else. He was no longer just a janitor. He was a witness. Perhaps the only witness strong enough to expose what was festering inside these walls. And though fear gnawed at him, a spark of determination lit inside. He would not let them bury the truth. The turning point had come. By the time the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air inside felt impossibly heavy. The trial had stretched for weeks, each day peeling away another layer of carefully crafted lies, another mask that Benjamin Cross had once worn to maintain the illusion of control. The prosecution's case had not been about drama, it had been about precision. Witness by witness, document by document, they reconstructed the story of how a respected businessman had slowly transformed into a manipulator, a predator, and ultimately, a killer. Across the aisle, the family of Rebecca Holloway sat in silence. Her younger brother clutched a folded piece of paper in his hands, the edges worn from being read and refolded too many times. It was a letter she had written to him years earlier, ordinary words of encouragement, nothing special to the world at large, but priceless to him. For weeks, the defense had tried to muddy her name, to make the jury think she was unstable, reckless, or somehow responsible for her own fate. Yet in the end, the truth had risen above the noise. She had been a woman whose only mistake was trusting the wrong person. The judge asked for the verdict. Time seemed to stall as the foreperson stood. His voice didn't waver. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Benjamin Cross, guilty of murder in the first degree." There was no cheer, no outburst. Just the quiet, audible release of breath from those who had waited too long for this moment. Benjamin sat motionless, his lips tightening, his eyes darting briefly toward the gallery. For the first time, there was no hint of arrogance left in his posture. He looked not like the powerful executive who once commanded boardrooms, but like a man who had finally run out of exits. The sentence came swiftly. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The weight of those words carried more than legal finality. It was the symbolic dismantling of the persona Benjamin had worked his entire adult life to protect. He had believed himself untouchable, the kind of man who could bend others to his will and manipulate the system to keep his hands clean. Yet the system, flawed though it often was, had finally closed its grip around him. The prosecution's final statement lingered long after court adjourned. This case is not just about a murder. It is about how deception corrodes everything it touches. About how charm can mask cruelty, and how silence from those around can enable evil to thrive. Rebecca's story is a warning, but it is also a reminder that the truth, however buried, can still prevail. As the weeks passed, media coverage began to fade. Another headline took its place, another scandal drew attention. But for those who had lived through it, the shadow of the case remained. Rebecca's colleagues still spoke of her with reverence, recounting her dedication and the projects she had left behind. Her family, though forever marked by grief, found solace in the fact that her killer would never walk free again. Justice could not bring her back, but it preserved the dignity of her memory. For investigators who worked the case, the lessons cut deeper. They had learned to look past appearances, to question the easy answers. It wasn't the dramatic evidence that convicted Benjamin Cross, it was the accumulation of smaller truths, inconsistencies in his timeline, the quiet testimony of a neighbor who remembered an unusual sound, the subtle financial records that exposed his motives. The case demonstrated that evil doesn't always announce itself with theatrics, sometimes it hides behind tailored suits and polished smiles. The psychological profile of Benjamin was later studied in criminology courses. Experts pointed out his narcissistic tendencies, his calculated need to dominate those around him, and his complete inability to view Rebecca as a human being rather than an obstacle. Students debated whether he had been shaped by childhood experiences or if his pathology had been present all along. But in the end, the answer mattered less than the outcome. He made choices conscious, deliberate choices that led to another person's death. One detail from the trial remained etched in the minds of everyone who followed the case. During cross-examination, when asked directly why he had never called for help after Rebecca collapsed, Benjamin's mask had slipped for just a moment. Because it wouldn't have changed anything, he muttered, his tone flat, devoid of remorse. That single line, stripped of humanity, revealed more about him than any psychological report could. It was chilling not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of its cold, casual certainty. Rebecca's brother later spoke at a victims' advocacy event, his voice steady but his eyes clouded with pain. "We can't stop every tragedy," he said, "but we can stop pretending that monsters always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the man sitting at the head of the table, giving a toast. Sometimes, they look like a mentor, a colleague, a friend. That's why we have to pay attention not just to what people say, but to what they do." The case of Benjamin Cross became a touchstone for discussions about corporate abuse, manipulation, and hidden violence within elite circles. Documentaries explored the dual life he had led, while investigative reports dug into the systemic failures that allowed him to evade scrutiny for so long. But for all the commentary and analysis, the essence of the story remained painfully simple. A woman with promise lost her life to a man who believed he had the right to control her. The final chapter of the story wasn't written in the courtroom but in the quiet resilience of those left behind. Rebecca's family launched a scholarship in her name to support young women entering fields where her voice once carried weight. Her colleagues completed the project she had started, inscribing her name on the dedication plaque. Each of these acts, however small, pushed back against the silence Benjamin had tried to impose. If there was a message to carry forward, it was this: evil thrives on silence, but justice thrives on persistence. The case proved that persistence can take years, can demand everything from investigators, families, and survivors, but in the end, it is the only antidote to deception. Benjamin Cross would spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls, his empire dismantled, his name reduced to a cautionary tale. But Rebecca Holloway's story would live on, not as a tragedy alone, but as a warning, a lesson, and a quiet spark for those determined to uncover the truth, no matter how carefully it is hidden.